All right, welcome into episode 20 of the Y Ball Starters podcast. Today, we are happy to be joined by Dave Deckard, the managing editor of Blazers Edge, the SB Nation site for the Portland Trail Blazers. Dave, thanks so much for coming on tonight.
Absolutely. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Doing well.
How are you?
Good.
Doing good.
Good. For listeners who might not know, who are kind of following us maybe more for the college hoops or for just kind of more casually, what's your role with Blazers Edge and how has that kind of kept you involved in keeping up with the team over the years?
Yeah, I'm the managing editor. I've been there since 2006, so that's 15 years now. And we cover the Blazers every day of the year, on season, off season, doesn't matter. We will bring you news, we'll bring you analysis. We do all kinds of stuff. We have a staff of 24 people working night and day to do that stuff for you. So it's a lot of fun. It's interesting. It's a lot of work, but it's certainly kept us on the pulse of the Blazers for a decade and a half now.
What have been some of the most interesting storylines over those 15 years to cover?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot that's been through a couple of eras, really three now. Kevin Pritchard getting fired 10 minutes before the 2010 NBA draft was a huge one. Obviously, the tragedy of Brandon Roy's knee problems, and then Greg Oden as well. LaMarcus Aldridge's free agency was really big. Damian Lillard's development has obviously been the story over the last 9 years. So, I mean, there's always something. It seems like every 5 years, something huge happens with the Blazers. Often it's bad, but
True.
it's still interesting, and they certainly have not been dull.
No, for sure not. Looking back at this last season, it certainly wasn't dull itself. Obviously, the shortened season, short off season, made some interesting moves, picking up Covington and Derrick Jones Jr. Nurkic was hurt, came back in the bubble, came back to start the season. Then he and CJ McCollum get hurt again. So they make a swing at the trade deadline. Portland goes and gets Norman Powell. They give up a good young piece in Gary Trent Jr. for a player that's a win now player in Norman Powell. Also giving up Rodney Hood in that deal. And then, of course, it didn't end the way Blazers fans wanted it to, falling in 6 to the Nuggets, especially after that Game 5 when it seemed like that just kind of took the wind out of the sails. And afterwards, Neil Olshey kind of alluded to the fact that it wasn't the fault of the roster necessarily for the shortcoming in the playoffs. In your guys' mind, Dave, you can go first for sure. Was it roster? Was it coaching? Was it a mixture? What do you think kind of led to that?
Well, it's always a mixture. I mean, Olshey, of course, is very glib at describing his own team and his own moves. That claim that it wasn't at all the roster was, well, it was the first two initials of Boise State University is what it was. So, it's obviously if you have Enes Kanter, if you have Carmelo Anthony, if you have CJ McCollum, Anthony Simons, Damian Lillard, all playing major moments in your rotation. And the best defender of those is probably Damian Lillard. I mean, he needs a lot of help to look good, and he does when he has the help, but it just wasn't there. I mean, that's 5 of your top 8 rotation players who just don't defend. And then you have Yusuf Nurkic, who went down with injury, and he was the key to the whole thing, and he wasn't there for half the season. And so, it all fell apart. And the lesson there being your defense is hanging on the thread, and it's only as good as Nurkic's health. And also, it doesn't matter who you add when you have that many holes, because Robert Covington was darn good, but didn't end up making a difference. We didn't see the best out of Derrick Jones Jr. That might have been coaching related, but that was close to it. Everything else was a product, I think, of the roster, and it doesn't matter who you have in there. Now, look, are they going to improve next year? Of course they are, because it's hard to get worse than historically bad. But
True.
That's going to be even a mediocre improvement is going to be seen as proof that the coaching change made the difference. It didn't, and unless they improve this roster, it won't make that much difference.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think maybe a better coach gets us past Denver, but I mean, just especially watching the Suns against the Clippers, this team is not beating Phoenix. Like, come on. Like, Phoenix is like an actual championship contender, and this roster wasn't.
Well, I think that's the thing, too, is you see so many teams reliant on good wing play. And with Portland, you're relying on 3 players who were 6'3". And out of those 3, Norman Powell's your 1+ defender. And then Dame's an okay on-ball defender occasionally, but there were times, too, where he was getting beat off the dribble real bad in the Denver series. So there definitely needs to be more of an emphasis on getting a piece that's got more size and more physicality. That's the thing that stood out to me in this playoff, is just the physicality of some of these teams. And watching like a Milwaukee play, it's like Portland can never match that type of intensity. They just don't have the pieces to.
Well, Norman Powell is your plus defender. And where did you play him? I mean, in a 3-guard lineup, he becomes the small forward. And you know what? He doesn't look good against 6'8", 6'10" guys because he's only 6'3". So do you think Terry Stotts was going, here, this is a great idea? I mean, even if we had no other shooting guard, I would put Powell at small forward because that's the best thing ever. Of course not. That's literally a roster issue. So, I don't know what Olshey's talking about, but whatever he's smoking is legal in Oregon now. So, I mean, maybe that played a part in the press conference.
Sure feels like that press conference. I mean, that was tough to listen to. It sure felt like he was going out there to save his job or something. That was tough.
I heard an interesting point too that and I don't know the ownership side of it as well as I do general management and coaching and the roster. But someone recently pointed out to me, would Olshey still be here if Paul Allen was still around? Because Paul Allen was much more bold. He obviously swung for it with the Seahawks roster. And he has built a championship. He has owned championship quality rosters in Portland as well. So I kind of wonder that too, if with the new ownership and everything kind of being in flux, whether Olshey would still be around if it was a little more stable with Paul Allen still around.
I don't know. It's tricky to speculate on because, a person passing so obliterates any sports narrative that I almost want to step around that a little bit. But I will say this. There were timing things. I mean, Olshey got his extension the year the Blazers went to the Western Conference Finals, which was also the first year that Jody Allen owned the team. And so she had, that was her one experience. And what are you going to do?
That's true.
You're brand new to it. You didn't want to be in this position. You don't have a lot of background. You've had better success than the team has had since 2000, 2000 literally. And and the guy seems to know what he's doing. Sure, okay, extensions for all. But that move doesn't look as good now 2 years down the road as it did at the time.
I think I'll go for Drew.
I was just going to kind of say, looking at that roster, kind of the body of work of this season, Dave, who surprised you the most in a good way? Like, oh, wow, they really took a step forward, or their improvements, and who was kind of disappointing? Like, we needed more from them.
Covington, I think, was the guy, followed closely by Anthony Simons. I say Covington because you knew he was going to be able to defend, but he really made a significant difference, even though the rest of the team was so leaky that it didn't really show. But he was good. And his three-point shooting got up to 40%, which is kind of a Blazers phenomenon. I mean, that happens often the forwards join the Trailblazers, but that shouldn't eclipse the fact that he was everything that they needed him to be. And Anthony Simons' quick release three and confidence in shooting it, that development was fantastic. This was kind of a up or down year for him, and he went up. So I think he's earned some consideration. The next guy to do that, by the way, is going to be Nasir Little. So we'll see what he's able to do next year. But Simons, I think, justified his position in the rotation. And now let's see what he can add to it.
I completely agree. I remember watching Little last year and being like, this dude cannot play. And then I remember, I think it was the Bucks game that he scored 30. We ended up losing by a lot. But he was like hitting shots like confidently and like off the dribble. And I was like, oh, like this dude like has like substantial basketball skills and like is substantially better than the year before. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think both Rocco, I mean, it felt like every game that they actually showed his stats, it would be like 3 blocks, 3 steals. And it's just like, he down the stretch of games too was absolutely massive. Just like Dame on the offensive end, like he was always coming up with either guarding the best player or like poking the ball loose with the best player running around. So yeah, he was absolutely incredible.
That was the frustrating part, was a lot of times it felt like that Covington was the only player sometimes trying on defense. I mean, you would have Nurk when Nurk was healthy. You had Nurk too, who would go through his spurts, and I felt like Powell did try as well. But just a lot of times it just felt like Covington was the one guy out there consistently putting an effort. And he's not even supposed to be an on-ball defender. He's supposed to be a help defender. So for him to take on that additional role, since he was the only player big enough and versatile enough to take on that role on the roster, that he really gained a lot of respect in my eyes over this past year.
Yeah, I think, and you speak to Nasir Little too. He's another guy that can be a plus defender. If you look at next year, a potential lineup, obviously it's a big what if Portland re-signs Norman Powell, but a little lineup of trotting out Dame, Little, Powell, Covington, and Nurkic should be able to get some stops, I think. If Little makes that development that you're talking about, Dave. And how about on the flip side of it, some guys that we just needed a little more from?
I mean, Derek Jones Jr. Was the obvious one. CJ McCollum started the season really well, but it's hard to ignore his playoffs performance. And he got his 20. I mean, look, the guy's good. If you're talking about, he kind of sucked and he only scored 21. Okay, that's not bad. But he really wasn't effective against the Nuggets at all, and they needed more from him in playoffs time. I think Nurkic, he gets a pass because of the injury, but the way he started the season was really rough. And it took him a little bit to swing back into form, but he almost did the anti-CJ. He looked better in the playoffs, despite being matched up against a guy that nobody was going to guard. He really put his heart into that playoff series, and I thought he played well. And
I did too.
It would have been nice to have had that consistently throughout the year, or at least to have come out that way and gotten the season off to a better start.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he fouled out because it felt like he was contesting every single shot. Like, I felt like every shot was at the rim and he was contesting every shot. So it would be like by mid fourth quarter, he would have 5 fouls just naturally, just like with how they called the game.
Almost. I mean, he had some Nurk fouls in there.
He did.
I think there was that one. It was in Game 6 where he went out to contest the 3-point shot and overshot and fouled. He picked up his 5th foul right after Stotts didn't pull him for the 4th.
Yes.
And that was a classic Nurk moment. Like, dude, the one thing you can't do is tweet that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would shade that a little bit and say that he wasn't that brilliant with his choice of fouls to take. That said, it's hard to ding him when he was out there trying so hard, which is exactly the point you made.
Yeah, exactly. But he had a couple of those.
Yeah. And speaking, I mean, this is just going to bring up another foul-prone guy. I actually thought maybe I don't want to say for the first time, because just depth is useful in the regular season as well. I thought in the playoffs, there were some times where really for probably the first time this season, I was like, we could really use Zach Collins right now, just as another defending big.
Yes.
Yeah, especially because Cantor he became so ineffective in the playoffs, especially because they were playing Millsap on him and they would just pull him out of
that was can't play Cantor.
That was tough.
Yeah, it was the exact opposite of 2019, right? When he actually looked really good when he was starting. But it was a different Nikola Jokic this year. And also, for some reason, a different Cantor. And you just wonder, I mean, he wasn't giving the Blazers consistent defense, but he was in the try-hard club too. And you had to admire what he did mid-season with Nurkic out. As soon as he went back to the bench, it's just like the light switch flipped off. And I get it, but boy, the Blazers didn't need that. They needed a good backup to Nurkic, and he just couldn't provide that.
Yeah, I know that was really surprising because Cantor played really well for stretches this season. So it was really surprising to see him struggle so much, even against the reserve units. And I know that Millsap was stretching him out, but even at that, to be out of position multiple times on defensive rebounds, to not be able to finish around the rim, the things that Kanter does excel at as an NBA player, and to see him not be able to do that, I thought that was really odd, and it limited what we could do with our lineups.
Right, well, but it was a smart point you made earlier too about Denver had bigs that could hit from the outside, which didn't allow Kanter to camp out in there or even shade toward the basket.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, he became completely ineffective.
Yeah. I'm going to ask an extremely loaded question. I'm just prefacing it right now. I know it's loaded, and we'll get, a little bit of both answers too, but just for the sake of the discussion, do you guys think, looking back at it, Terry Stotts was a good coach?
Yeah, I would say overall for the most part. I mean, there were struggles. It was, the problem is because, Terry's struggles have pretty much been there since the start. So because we've seen the same things for so long, it kind of makes them worse in the mind. But we have made the playoffs 8 straight times, which is something to hang your hat on. Like, that is impressive. It definitely has gotten closer to net zero over the last couple of years since the conference finals run, particularly this year. He did do a lot during, especially the Aldridge era. I know, Drew, you talked about it, that when we had that power forward, he definitely seemed to be more creative, and there was a lot more action going around and a lot less dribbling into contested jump shots.
Yes.
I don't think there's any doubt about it. He's the second winningest coach in franchise history.
Yeah.
He's 4th by winning percentage, but he's really the only one of those 4 who didn't inherit a team that was bound to win. He and Neil came in just as the Roy Oden era fell apart. So, they had, his first year was losing badly, and he built up that Batum, Lopez, Aldridge, Lillard, Matthews lineup into one that some of my colleagues think was legitimately ready to contend before the injuries happened.
I agree.
And that was a beautiful style of basketball, the best that they've been seen since the Ramsey era, really. As far as pure unselfish. Now, obviously, Clyde's teams played better, but they played very forceful, physical, brutal style.
Sure.
As far as poetry, you have Ramsey and you have Stotts. And also, he has the 4th winningest playoff percentage. But the caveat there is none of Portland's coaches have done well in the playoffs.
Right.
Still one of the best coaches in franchise history. And by the way, another one of those, I believe, was Mike Schuler, who lasted like 2 years. So, really, in fact, he's number 2 or 3 on almost every meaningful stat. So I don't think there's any doubt that he was good. But here's the thing that you got to remember. He was also bound to a certain set of things. And mostly, he was bound to Lillard and McCollum.
Yes.
Everybody thinks it's really easy to, why didn't you do what? Okay, you can't do that. It's like Jenga. And Lillard and McCollum were built on that tower from the foundations of his tenure. And you know what? You don't get to pull that stick at the bottom. You just can't. If you do, the whole thing's going to fall. So he had to coach with that as a given. And he actually did pretty well. 2 or 3 years ago, the team was like 7th in the league in defense. And that was with, the 3 that they have now is the big stars, and also Aminu, Harkless, and a couple other guys. So he actually cobbled together a pretty good defense out of that. The problem is not that he couldn't coach it. The problem is that's the exact year that Yusuf Nurkic broke his leg. And it's never been the same since. Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of revisionist history. There's a lot of what have you done for me lately and myopia about this. I don't think there's any doubt that he was a very, very good coach. Was he the best defensive coach in the universe? Probably not. No. But you know what? Had those injuries not happened or had better lineup moves, trades been made, it wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah, it would have definitely been interesting to see Terry Stotts with a lineup that didn't include that core of Lillard and McCollum, because you're right, we never really got to see that once that got set and got rolling. that's what we were stuck with for the last quite a few years. But I do think, to Terry Stotts' credit, I mean, I've been following the NBA since 2012. So I kind of missed right around the time that Brandon Roy and all that fell apart. But I remember just even when Aldridge and Batum and Matthews, when they all left and we were supposed to be terrible that following season, we bring in Harkless, Davis, Gerald Henderson. And that was a super fun team. And he did an excellent job with that team, taking us to the playoffs when we were not supposed to be anywhere near there. And we were supposed to go through a rebuild again. And instead we've made the playoffs now for, what is this, eight straight years in a row, I want to say.
Most in the league at the
yeah.
moment,
So, I mean, credit to Terry Stotts. He's done an excellent job. But I do think even with the limitations on the roster, I think that there still were some issues that prevented us from, with even some of our past rosters, from competing a little bit more in the playoffs, and just with some of his lack of creativity.
Down the stretch, yeah. I remember when he started, we seemed to be running like, I remember thinking like, wow, every out of bounds play was like masterful. So I don't know when that changed. I know, Dave, you said around the conference finals when you kind of noticed a change.
Yeah, when Nurkic went down. I mean, look, this roster is predicated on a healthy use of Nurkic. I mean, that's when they were good. And you still saw it when he was able to be productive. They were actually pretty good. But without him, it's like saying, hey, Terry, write a novel, but you can't use any vowels except for one, and it's you. Okay? You're not going to be perceived as a great author. You're a great author if you can just pull off a chapter. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not too much. He never got his full alphabet to spell with, and that really inhibited what he could do. Also, he was prohibited from, look, the ding on him is that he's a bad defensive coach. Yeah. But everybody who's going to coach Lillard and McCollum is going to look mediocre at best. He looked less than mediocre, granted, but there was no world in which his coaching took the Blazers past the Warriors all those years when they got stopped. The Pelicans series was a bad one, and that was a system-wide failure, included coaching, included guard play, everything fell apart. But they came back the next year without Nurkic, by the way, and made it to the Western Conference Finals. So that balances out. Everything around those two was pretty predictable, and the Blazers did just about as well as they could. I mean, literally, they got stopped by the Warriors every year until they hit the Lakers last year, who went on to win the championship. And then this year with the Nuggets that they should have beat because Jamal Murray was out. So this was another bad one. This one in the Pelicans. Denver, the 2019 was a good one. Everything else was pretty predictable. Well, no, there's another good one. They beat the Clippers, right?
Yeah.
Now, albeit Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, everybody that and the roster went down, but still they did make it to the second round. So you're really 2-2, 2 exceeding expectations, 2 below expectations, everything else attributable to hitting the world champions in the bracket.
Hey, I do want to point out that we did beat Blazer killer Austin Rivers in that Clippers series that year. So there was that.
Every time. I don't get it. It seems like, I mean, we don't have a hire yet, so there's nothing final, but the second interviews so far have been with Chauncey Billups, Mike D'Antoni, and Becky Hammond. What do you guys kind of think of some of those hires? I'm intrigued by all of them, and I personally don't see a bad option. I think in my mind I could see a limitation there. I think with D'Antoni, it's obvious. You would expect the offense to be amazing and the defense to maybe still struggle. I don't know if that would change, especially if the personnel is the same, like you mentioned, Dave. I think Hammond, Popovich tutored her, and they run a really creative offensive system, and they demand a lot from their players and usually exceed expectations. And Chauncey Billups is another intriguing one, a guy that I remember Dame actually getting compared to before Dame became truly elite.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I know they're all on their second round of interviews. It's going to be interesting because 2 of them because they haven't been head coaches. It's so hard to say. And obviously with D'Antoni, we've been able to see him at a few different stops now. So we've been able to see a few different things from him. But the other 2 are also still extremely interesting, despite not having that former experience.
If it's not a championship pedigree coach, it probably doesn't matter. I mean, Any of
Yeah,
them
sure.
are probably good. Now, that doesn't mean one of them turns out worse, and it may be the one the Blazers hire. Who knows? But there's no way to tell from this end of it which
Yes.
that's going to be. I mean, if you can't go out and get an Eric Spoelstra or Rick Carlisle, which would be obvious looks, you know, it's 6 of one, half dozen of another.
Yeah, it's way too hard to tell. I mean, I think D'Antoni would do a good job in the system. I mean, at least he's got the track record there, and we know what we would get in him. I would like to say Hammond would do a good job just because she has been under Popovich's system. And then Billups is the one that I mean, I know he's a really good player. He's in a culture in with the Clippers, but I just don't know enough about him to be able to say how he would do as coach here. So I feel like it's kind of a bit of a toss-up.
Yeah, I think it's going to depend a lot on what the roster looks like too, just because we're so uncertain with what we know about what the roster is going to be. But I mean, you almost have to wait to see the roster to really make a good judgment, even prejudgment on a coach. Just because, I mean, yeah, it's a great point that Dave's made a couple of times of Lillard and McCollum. There are limitations because they are two very similar players. And because they take up so much salary cap too, that it limits your flexibility, which is, I mean, it's obviously stuff that we've known for years. That's been the topic of conversation for years. But that's, it's going to be interesting to see what the next era looks like, because it feels like there's a changing of the guard this year as well.
Yeah. And
I mean, how does Lillard take a coach? That's the main. You know, what does Dame think? And is there a coach that can prevent Dame dissatisfaction? And I don't know that there is, unless you get the obvious name. You know, if I have a big name coach come in, then I nod and say, well, maybe this person knows something, and I'll ride with it a couple years. Yeah. But boy, if you're a first-time coach or a kind of a retread, you have a year, I think, to turn things around before Dame starts getting really itchy, and everybody starts getting really itchy for Dame, which, by the way, has already happened. So it's tough.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's I mean, obviously, Dame hasn't publicly said anything about demanding a trade, and obviously, that's an extremely annoying thing for Portland fans to hear, knowing how hard it is for us to sign free agents. But yeah, I mean, you check Twitter, you check any sort of SB Nation blog or Bleacher Report community, whatever. I mean, there are Dame proposals from any major market, from any team, because I mean, just a player at that level, still in his prime, and just with that mentality, is very coveted, obviously. So yeah, I agree. I'm pretty sure it was actually Dame that said that he wanted to wait another year to see what the franchise did, or was that a fake quote, or was that actually from Dame? Do you know, Dave?
Yeah, I don't think he said anything like that openly. He's not giving he's not even giving any indication publicly that he wants to leave.
Yeah.
People are just surmising, I think, with reasonably good circumstantial evidence. So, I mean, I doubt that there's an actual quote from him. But look, this is, first of all, Blazer fans can't be surprised. Second of all, they can't blame him if he does make that move.
Not at all.
And third, I mean, even the way we talk is part of the issue. I mean,
yes,
Portland can't sign free agents. Is that because of something inherently in Portland? Or is that because there's been literally nothing besides Lillard, and that only lately, to distinguish the Blazers from any of 25 other NBA teams who are all looking for that miracle signing to turn them around? I would argue it's as much the latter as the former. That you're just one of, I mean, you need to be number one or number two in line to get those premium items. And you're holding number 13 or number 23, depending on the year. You're just not going to get it. That PlayStation 5 is gone by the time you get up there in the queue.
Yeah.
Right.
That's basically, that's not because you're Portland. It's because you don't have you don't have the roster, you don't have the track record, you don't have the plan to get you up there in that line. And by the way, the Lakers are always number one. So now you got to get to number two. And teams do it. Miami does it. Boston sometimes. The Clippers. Dallas. Okay, it's possible. But I mean, even San Antonio has made a signing or two, but the Blazers just don't have that. At Golden State, okay, now I've just named 8 teams, only 2 of which you would naturally suspect would be up front there. The Blazers just aren't that distinguished. And that's because we talked about moving the needle in 2012, and for 9 years, where has it moved? Despite except that one little spike in 2019, which immediately went back down. Where has the needle moved? It's literally the same spot it was before Brandon Roy got injured. First round playoff exits.
Yeah, that's the tough thing about exiting consistently in the first round is that you don't make that move up, but yet you also don't make that move down either, where you're getting the lottery picks and getting those elite players that could help put you over the top eventually down the road, like what Oklahoma City's doing. I know they're an extreme example, but
they had it. They had it in 2017. People talk about the disastrous cap space use of 2016, which is correct. That was terrible. That was franchise sinking. But then they had another chance to redeem themselves in the draft in 2017. They traded up to get Zach Collins with Donovan Mitchell on the board, Bam Adebayo, John Collins. I mean, the list of people who were there to be got either with their native picks or by trading up to the spot they got was pretty significant. And by the way, some teams that have gotten either pretty far in the playoffs or gotten some pretty gaudy regular season records took those players. The Blazers didn't. And by the way, also, I remember distinctly Damian Lillard before that draft. Damian Lillard himself going, Donovan Mitchell.
Yeah, he
they
did.
Yep.
Oh, man. I remember talking to these guys even back then. Granted, we didn't know before the draft that Donovan Mitchell was going to be this good, but it was even like a year later where we were like, Portland could have traded CJ McCollum in a Paul George package because Paul George wanted out of Indiana at that point and drafted Donovan Mitchell, and they would have had Dame, George, and Mitchell, and that's a championship team.
Yeah, although George might have left for LA anyway. That's why they didn't want
Possibly.
or to trade CJ.
Yeah.
Because he was aiming toward LA. But that said, yeah, I mean, the point holds. And even, by the way, if you don't have Paul George, you can trade CJ for something.
Yes.
Right? I mean, at that point, CJ becomes expendable like he is this year, except you would have had guaranteed Donovan Mitchell instead of hoping that Norman Powell resigns with you. So, yeah, I mean, the 2017 was also a big stumble. So they had the chance in the draft. They had the chance with the cap space. The middle years of Olshey's tenure were absolutely disastrous, and there's no other way to put it. He drafted Damian Lillard at the beginning. He hired Terry Stotts. He then drafted C.J. McCollum. That was a really good start. Everything after that, besides Yusuf Nurkic, was a really bad stumble.
Yeah.
So you're talking about you're talking about CJ being expendable, being a trade option then. So is the chance to redeem him now at this point for Olshey with maybe Ben Simmons out there? I know that's kind of the hot one that people are talking about. Do you think that's realistic?
I don't think it's realistic to get him just for CJ.
No, I don't think so either.
This is like we need to have Philly fans and Blazer fans in the same room. Because Philly fans are going, we'll give you Simmons for Damian Lillard, and Blazer fans are going, we'll take Simmons for C.J. McCollum. And both of them, they're like talking right past each other. They're like, I'm going to write this actually. They're like going to a car dealership, and you've got the thought bubble where you're going, I'm going to get $5,000 off this car, and the dealer's going, I'm going to charge him $5,000 extra for this car. And the two are not meeting. That said, if they can get Simmons for a CJ package, they ought to do that. Yes. Because he's a unique player. But Philly is going to have a hard time parting with him for CJ for exactly that reason. And I don't think CJ has the value that Blazer fans think he does, because they're still thinking 2 years ago. He's 30. He's not 28, let alone 26 anymore. Yeah. He still scores. He's a great offensive player, but he's shown he's not a defender. He's probably shown he's not a point guard at this point, although he's been playing a little bit more like it this season. So, I mean, there's still a glimmer of hope, but tell me a team that wants a guy who's 30 years old, whose main and only thing is scoring, and who might not be a number one option. That's not entirely attractive.
That's tough. Yeah, you have to think that a team that would want a CJ McCollum would be someone that's a scoring punch away from a title. Like that's the sort of team that he's going to fit, which in theory would be Philadelphia in theory.
I feel like in practice too, to some degree.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
But they're
but
going to want
yeah,
more for him. Yeah, but
yeah, exactly.
the bonus there is they're paying Simmons a fortune, so they can afford this fortune that is CJ McCollum. But anyone else outside of the Knicks, Lakers, and Clippers is going to look at that contract and go, yeah, that's a number one option level, $36 million a year. I want Giannis for that. I mean,
Yeah, no kidding.
Or at least Chris Middleton, which he's the other guy who makes that much, but he is not a number one option. But he defends. I mean, and he does a lot of other stuff. CJ kind of doesn't. So it's a tough sell.
So what do you would say is a realistic like value, since CJ is an extremely difficult player to gauge like value wise, just like on the trade market, like do you think they even trade him? Do you think like what his value is? Do you know, like, or is it kind of all up in the air?
If you keep Norman Powell, you have to trade him, because I think if you don't trade him, you won't keep Norman Powell.
Yeah.
I mean, A, you can't afford it, and B, he's not going to stay to play small forward and be a third option.
No.
I mean, he can make more. He can make the same money doing more elsewhere. So I think you got to move him. And I tell you what, I'm not sure what let's put it this way, his value is situational, like you say. To the right team, he has value, but I don't think there's a real abstract. I mean, there are ups to him, which is he can score against anybody. He's a great mid-range player. He has a three-point shot. There are downs to him, even on offense. He doesn't drive. He doesn't draw fouls. Also, he doesn't defend. He can pass. I mean, that's a positive. But he's making a fortune, like we said, and he's old. So that's a needle that you got to thread pretty narrowly. To the right team, there's value. But that right team is probably the ones you've mentioned. Philadelphia. I could see Milwaukee, right?
Sure.
Atlanta, probably not. I mean, the Lakers, obviously. The Clippers, yeah. But what have those teams got to give you back? If you can't get Ben Simmons, what's next on that list? Milwaukee's not giving up Chris Middleton. You can't use Jrue Holiday.
Yeah.
So what's coming back from them? What are the Clippers giving up? They're not giving up one of their big two for him. The Lakers have literally nothing that I don't know, Dennis Schroeder? No. I mean, especially not with Lillard.
Kyle Kuzma.
Yeah, Kyle Kuzma.
No, thank you.
I'll keep the 3-guard lineup at that point. Well, I know the other name from Philly was Tobias Harris as well, before Ben Simmons even came into play. But I mean, I don't know what a package for that would really look like. I don't know if Tobias Harris really helped his stock at all over this playoff.
Yeah, and if I'm Philly, I might like Harris better, honestly.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Especially if I'm trading Simmons somewhere. I mean, the hot thing is still that they're going to send Simmons somewhere. But I'm not sure Portland's first in line there. I'm not sure CJ is the most attractive guy. But here's the thing, and I've been saying this multiple places. The nice thing about re-signing Powell, if you can do it, is you don't have to get equal value for CJ anymore. Because in essence, you traded CJ for Powell and whoever you bring back. And Powell fills a lot of holes that CJ left. And this is the difference between 2021 and, say, 2018 or 2019, is there was a big demand on what's coming back because you didn't have Gary Trent Jr. hadn't grown yet, right? You didn't have that other guy who could fill shooting guard. So you had to fill CJ's spot and get something more in order to make that trade work. That's not great. Hard to do. But this year, if you get Powell, you just have to get something for him. So that's the hope.
Yeah, I know, John, you and I kind of talked about that a while ago. I think the point I made was I don't expect Portland to necessarily get a player as good as CJ McCollum individually in a McCollum trade, but they don't have to your point, necessarily. What you need is guys that can build around Lillard and Powell, like probably wings, honestly, if you can get serviceable wings, maybe another more classic power forward. Because I personally think Collins is gone. I think they're going to try and trade Zach Collins. His value's not high right now at all because he hasn't played in 2 years. But
I think that, and that opens the field of teams that that are going to be interested in McCollum. Whereas if you're giving up lesser pieces to consolidate for a better player, then there's going to be more teams that are going to be willing to take on that contract. Because, yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's been something Portland's known when discussing CJ McCollum trades is the contract is really hard to deal with and really hard to convince teams to want to take in, especially now that he's on the north side of 30.
Dallas, Memphis, New York. Sure. I think actually the Knicks might like him, but what have they got if they're not willing to trade their lottery pick? But they have cap space; they can absorb him, and he's the classic kind of Knicks signing, a guy who maybe looks a little better than he is on paper. So, might work.
Hey, Dallas, we could take on Kristaps.
Oh, yeah, well.
No, thank you.
Yeah, unhappy Nurkic and no defense. And I wouldn't mind, under different circumstances, I wouldn't mind trying to redeem him. But, oh boy, yeah.
It's a risk.
That would be tough.
Yeah, and with Nurkic on board, you could see Nurkic just completely throwing down his hat and stomping all over it. And
yes,
I am gone.
It's a light.
First of all, you didn't pay me enough, and now you bring on a guy making that who's worse than me in almost every way.
Yeah, literally in almost every way, and who's not aggressive on offense despite being 7'3". It's tough. Yeah, I think a consolidation. Plus, we've seen recently some deeper teams have more success. Obviously, you do need that top level talent, and you do need the top level defense too. I think was really shown. You look at Brooklyn, and obviously most having to do with their injuries, but some of their role players really couldn't guard Milwaukee 1-on-1, which really hurt them down the stretch. Again, having to do with injuries, but it's not like Harden and Irving are defensive locks. But I think what's really important is focusing on the defense because. Coming out of the last era, I think what really struggled with a lot was Portland's offensive consistency, and so there was a more emphasis on that, which is a good thing. But I think just because it's been so long, the focus on offensive consistency has led to the defensive consistency lacking, which I think they're probably going to focus on just because of how bad they were this year.
Yeah, it's fair. Well, Powell will help with that, and maybe if they can get a 3 who can defend a little bit, or maybe Mr. Little is that guy, so they go for a 4.
Yeah.
4s are less valuable than they were 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So, maybe there's a power forward out there. We haven't brought up, since we're bringing up horrible gets, Kevin Love.
Yeah.
CJ can go home to Cleveland. Kevin Love, who makes $1 billion to be a shell of the player he used to be.
Yeah, I wonder if you could look into a CJ, like a Love, and then some young piece to take on that horrific contract. Do you know how many years Love has left? It's only got to be like 1 or 2 by now, right?
He has a couple, I think. I haven't looked it up, but he's not expiring as far as I remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, replenishing picks might be an option too, because the unspoken thing is the Blazers, traded away this year's pick to get Robert Covington.
Yeah.
So, he's been great, but boy, if they didn't win, and that's a win now move, and they spent a first round pick to do it, you're going to miss those picks at some point. As it might not be bad with your right hand. Yeah, we want to win, but with your left hand, you know what? We also want a few draft picks because at some point we're going to be in a post-Dame era. So
yeah,
right. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Well, Dave, thanks so much for taking some time out of your day to hop on here with us. How can Blazers fans find you and see your stuff on Blazers Edge?
Oh, you can find us on Blazers Edge. Me and a lot of other people at Blazers Edge is the Twitter handle, or at Dave Deckard, Deckard. We're around. You can always find us day or night and say hello. It's a great place to comment. It's a great place to think. And usually we're 1 or 2 moves ahead enough to be able to give you an insight about what's coming down the pike as soon as it becomes evident. So watch as we head into free agency, and let's see what happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you can find us here at Y Ball Starters. subscribe on YouTube and follow us on Spotify. And we're on social media as well, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all at YBall Starters. Thanks to everyone listening in, and have a great night.